welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, really, is to cut through the noise, get right to the heart of some complex ideas, and do it quickly and thoroughly. It's all custom-tailored for you, the listener.
And today we're digging into a stack of sources, mostly excerpts from a chapter on conservatism in Western political thought. We want to pull out the key insights for you.
Exactly. And the focus. It's squarely on the origins, the core ideas of modern conservatism.
Yeah.
We're tracing its birth, looking especially at Edmund Burke and his powerful reaction to the French Revolution.
Yeah, this material really shows how a response to one huge historical moment ended up shaping a whole political philosophy, one that's, stuck around.
That's right. We're going to unpack Burke's main arguments, and some might surprise you. We'll look at his predictions about the revolution, which were, frankly, uncannily accurate.
And explore how his ideas have been used, interpreted, sometimes twisted over the years.
But get ready to see how reacting to a revolution ended up creating a cornerstone of political thought that, well, still fuels debates today.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. If you trace Western political thought, maybe from Machiavelli and the Renaissance on, you get these incredible ideas bubbling up.
Right, big ideas.
Big ideas. But for centuries, our source points out, they were mostly just that, essentially ideas. Discussed, debated, written about, sure, but the actual political and social structures across Europe, they stayed pretty stable. The ancient regime, the old order, kind of held on.
Until 1789. That's the year everything changes.
Totally. The French Revolution wasn't just, another king getting overthrown. It was this massive moment where Enlightenment ideas were, for the first time really, put into practice on a huge scale.
And it didn't just shake France. It sent shockwaves across Western Europe.
Right. And the ideals the revolutionaries proclaimed, on the surface, they sound a lot like the liberal ideas we talk about today.
Yeah, things like equality, natural rights.
Absolutely. The core ideas were radical.
Mm-hmm.
Humans are inherently equal. They have natural rights. No government can just take away. And governments need the consent of the governed, pointing towards democracy. That was the banner they marched under.
But, and this is crucial, the source emphasizes this. Unlike, say, the American Revolution, which also had liberal ideals, the French Revolution led to very illiberal consequences.
Mm-hmm. And that contrast, that huge gap between the noble goals and the brutal reality in France, that's the key backdrop. It's what sparks the development of this counter-liberal philosophy, as the source calls it. Conservatism.
So it wasn't just knee-jerk reactionism.
Not according to this view. It was a deep philosophical response to what happened when you tried to apply abstract ideas so radically.
Okay, so let's quickly walk through the revolution itself as the source outlines it. It helps understand Burke's reaction. It kicks off 1789. France is broke.
Basically bankrupt, yeah. So the king has to do something unusual called the States General, which hadn't met since, 1614?
A long time.
A very long time. And the structure was unbalanced. 3 estates. You had the nobility, the clergy, and then the third estate, everyone else, basically. Mostly the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie.
And the first two, nobility and clergy, they liked things as they were. They had privileges. The church was established.
Right. They supported the status quo. But the third estate, fundamentally unhappy. They wanted more power, more representation.
And they were pretty clever politically. They managed to increase their numbers and basically force the 3 estates to merge into one body, the National Assembly.
Yep. And this new National Assembly gets right to work. Their big move. Passing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The source calls it the death knell of the old regime.
And it promised all those great liberal things: equality before the law, fair taxes, equal access to jobs, property rights, free speech.
On paper, yes. But the way they implemented it was incredibly radical. They didn't just tweak the government. They tried to rebuild the entire social and political order.
From the ground up.
Totally. The source lists it out. Aristocracy as a privileged class, gone. Church power, broken. Lands confiscated. Political structure, overhauled local to national. King's power, slashed. Legislature's power, massively increased.
And you can imagine such huge, fast changes didn't sit well with everyone, not just the nobles and clergy.
No way. Huge parts of French society were alienated. Peasants, devout Catholics, people who just wanted slower change. This internal conflict, plus other European monarchies getting scared the revolution would spread,
Led to military pressure on France.
Exactly. And that pressure, internal and external, kind of pushes the revolution into its darkest phase. More extreme factions, like the Jacobins, take over.
And under the Jacobins, those initial liberal ideals. pretty much out the window.
Yeah, the source mentions the grim results: executing the king and queen, widespread executions of supposed enemies of the revolution, the reign of terror.
Eventually, the Jacobins fall too. Robespierre himself gets the guillotine. But the source says the revolution failed to return to its original ideals.
They just couldn't set up a stable government, a workable constitution. Chaos persisted, and that instability created an opening for, well, a military strongman, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Ah, Napoleon.
Mhm.
His role is just full of contradictions,
Right. He rises as the supposed savior of the revolution.
and almost immediately becomes an absolute dictator and eventually emperor.
But here's the irony. As his armies marched across Europe, they actually destroyed the old regimes everywhere they went, and they introduced liberal reforms in conquered lands.
So a dictator spreading liberal ideas through conquest.
It's bizarre. The source makes this striking point. Without Napoleon, ironically, liberal democratic Europe as we understand it would not exist.
Wow, okay, so Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815. What happens then? A backlash.
A big one. A period of reaction across Europe. The old powers try to rewind the clock.
The Holy Alliance.
That's it. A group of monarchies dedicated to restoring the old ways, the illiberal ideals. But the source suggests, in the long run, they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. The forces unleashed by the revolution and Napoleon, they could not be undone. That push for liberal democracy continued.
And it's during this time of political reaction that the theoretical reaction really takes shape. A philosophy pushing back against the revolution and its liberalism.
And that reaction is conservatism, and its first, most important voice, Edmund Burke. An Anglo-Irish guy, member of Parliament in Britain, lived 1729 to 1797.
And he didn't wait until it was all over. He published his big work, Reflections on the Revolution in France, in 1790, right in the middle of it.
And the source says he utterly rejected the revolution and its ideals.
And this book was huge.
Immensely influential. It became the Bible of the Holy Alliance, giving them philosophical ammo, and the source argues it's still the Bible of conservatism to this day.
It's worth remembering, though, Burke wasn't some academic sitting in an ivory tower.
No, not at all. He was a hands-on politician, deeply involved in the debates of his day.
So his writings, like Reflections, they weren't systematic treatises. They were responses to specific things happening.
Exactly. Responses to the American situation, British rule in India, and especially the French Revolution. That's why, as the source notes, you kind of have to piece his philosophy together from speeches, letters, pamphlets. It's not all laid out in one neat system.
Okay, so you've got this chaotic, world-changing event in France, a continent-wide reaction, and this very thoughtful politician in Britain trying to make sense of it all. That whole situation really forged this new way of thinking.
And the first step in understanding Burke, according to this material, is to challenge the common view of what conservatism is. His philosophy is presented as the very opposite of what the popular idea would lead one to believe.
Because we usually think of conservatism as just, resisting change, being anti-liberal, defending the old ways no matter what.
Right. But the philosophical conservatism that comes from Burke, the source says it's neither inherently anti-reform nor fundamentally illiberal. Burke wasn't necessarily against liberal goals like freedom or property rights. He accepted many of them.
So what was his problem then?
His deep disagreement was with the philosophical grounding the French revolutionaries used for those ideals and, crucially, how they tried to implement them politically.
And his attack on the French Revolution is really the key to unlocking that disagreement.
Absolutely. Burke saw something most people at the time missed. He argued the liberalism driving the French Revolution was radically different from the liberalism of the American Revolution or Britain's glorious revolution of 1688.
While everyone else saw 1789 as the next logical step after 1688 and 1776, Burke saw a huge gap, an unbridgeable chasm.
And the key difference for him: the French were trying to impose these strictly rational a priori standards of natural right. They were taking abstract philosophical concepts, pure reason, natural equality, and trying to build a society based only on that logic, ignoring, as he saw it, the real nature of society and the real needs of human beings as they actually lived.
And he thought this abstract approach would end badly.
He predicted it. He foresaw that trying to govern by pure abstraction would lead to a very illiberal society, maybe even tear society apart completely.
So his critique starts with a fundamental disagreement about rights themselves. The revolutionaries talked about abstract, universal natural rights.
And Burke fires back with a core idea. Rights, he says, are inherently social rather than individual. Why? Because humans are naturally social animals. We aren't born as isolated atoms who then decide to form a society through some contract.
Which goes right against Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, who pictured this state of nature where individuals existed before society, holding rights, and only came together to protect them.
Burke basically called that state of nature idea a dangerous myth. You can't build a solid theory of rights on the fantasy that humans could exist outside society. He famously said, "The state of civil society is a state of nature. Being in society is our natural condition."
And if society is natural, then rights come from society,
Yeah.
not from some abstract place outside.
That's the logic. For Burke, what makes a right or an institution legitimate isn't just abstract reason, it's that it's recognized as such by the society at large. He calls these prescriptive rights and institutions. They're given or prescribed by society through its long historical development.
And the basis for this prescription is tradition.
Exactly. If rights, practices, ways of governing have evolved over historical time, been tested, adapted, and are generally accepted as legitimate by the community, then they usually have validity, even, he argues, if they don't perfectly align with some abstract logical theory of natural rights. Because we're social beings, no right is truly real unless it's socially condoned.
He even used the British Constitution as his example, called it a prescriptive constitution, its authority coming just from having existed time out of mind. Not from a single document, but from history and acceptance.
Now, Burke wasn't saying there are no universal moral principles. He clearly believed in some abstract rights, like life and property. You see that in his fight against the East India Company's abuses in India, he prosecuted Warren Hastings based on the idea that the laws of morality are the same everywhere. Denying basic rights to Indians, he argued, threatened rights everywhere.
Okay, so he accepts universal principles in the abstract. But the crucial point is, they don't exist that way in society.
Exactly. They exist concretely in society. And because they're embedded in real social structures, traditions, laws, they undergo, as he puts it vividly, such a variety of refractions and reflections that it becomes absurd to talk of them as if they continued in the simplicity of their original direction.
So the abstract idea of a right to property is one thing.
But Burke would say the real question is, how does that right actually function in this specific society? Property rights are utterly modified by society. Laws about inheritance, taxes, usage, all sorts of things shape them. So it's absurd to talk about any right, even life or property, as if it exists in its pure abstract state of nature form within society.
And trying to apply those pure abstract rights directly is not just absurd, but downright politically dangerous.
This is a really key counterintuitive claim. He says something striking. In proportion as natural rights are metaphysically true, they are morally and politically false.
Wait, how can being more true metaphysically make something more false politically? That sounds backwards.
Because, Burke argues, the purer, more abstract, more metaphysically true a right is, the further it is from the messy, complex reality of how rights actually exist prescriptively within society. If you try to impose that pure abstraction onto the real world, you can only destroy the right as it actually functions. And the more abstractly pure the right you're trying to impose, the more destructive it must be.
Okay, let's take the French Revolution's big idea, equality. Humans are created equal, therefore they should have equal rights. Seems logical.
Burke's response, from his view, is devastating. Okay, maybe in some abstract philosophical sense, humans are created with equal dignity. Fine. But he insists it does not follow politically that they should enjoy equal rights.
Why not?
Because he'd say, look around. People's actual existing prescriptive rights, the rights they have in this society based on history, law, custom, are simply not equal. They never have been. And in Burke's view, they never realistically can be in a complex society.
So trying to force equality leads to?
If you try to impose abstract equality by political decree, you destroy the existing unequal prescriptive rights. And since rights only have reality for Burke when they are prescriptive, rooted in social acceptance and history, the result isn't a lovely new society of equal rights. The result is the loss of all rights and the destruction of the very social orders and institutions that give those rights reality.
And this, the source argues, is exactly what Burke predicted for France.
His Reflections is basically one long attack on this absurd and dangerous attempt to apply abstract natural rights doctrine as a political program. He saw them, in the name of abstract rights, destroying the real, concrete, prescriptive rights of the aristocracy, the clergy, and as a consequence, he believed, undermining the rights of the people as a whole.
So the core insight is, Pure philosophical principles don't map neatly onto political reality. Trying to force them destroys the political domain.
Yes. The political domain is destroyed whenever it is made to conform to purely abstract philosophical principles. Pure reason, absolute rationality, geometric logic. Burke thinks they have no place in politics because society is just too complex, too rooted in history and human nature. It simply does not conform to philosophical abstractions, and trying to make it conform will, he argued, destroy itself.
And he had other reasons too, right? Beyond just prescriptive rights for why pure philosophy is bad for politics.
Yeah, a couple more key ones. One is what he linked to prescription, presumption. He saw presumption as an authority in the constitution of the human mind.
Like an innate bias.
Sort of. A built-in tendency to favor any settled scheme of government, any established way of doing things, over some untried project, especially if the nation has done reasonably well under the old system for a long time. For Burke, this inclination to support tradition is inherent in human nature, part of the very structure of the human mind. So, trying to impose purely abstract philosophical systems goes against human nature itself, making it unworkable.
Okay, and the second reason. This involves that tricky word, prejudice.
Right. It sounds bad to us now, but Burke uses it deliberately. He argues that respecting society's prescriptive structure, its traditions and established institutions, is actually exercising the highest form of political rationality. It's a collective historical reason better than any single person's logic.
And that higher collective wisdom is what he calls prejudice.
Yes. There's that famous, often misunderstood passage where he says we should cherish our old prejudices because they are prejudices, especially the long-lasting, widely held ones.
And he says we shouldn't rely on our own private stock of reason because it's small. Better to use the general bank and capital of nations and of ages.
That's the heart of it. Individual reason is limited. The accumulated wisdom embedded in tradition, in these prejudices, represents generations of experience. Smart people, he argued, should look for the latent wisdom in common prejudices, not just dismiss them. If you find that wisdom, and he thought you usually would, it's better to keep the prejudice with its embedded reason than to cast away the coat of prejudice and to leave nothing but the naked reason.
So political reason isn't just logic, it's historical, built up over time. History itself contains rationality.
Yes. So, to know what's politically appropriate rights, government, etc., you look to history and tradition, not just abstract philosophy.
Which is the opposite of the Enlightenment tendency to use individual reason to critique history as irrational.
Right. Think of contract theory again, arguing existing institutions are irrational because I today wouldn't rationally agree to them. Burke saw that as essentially ahistorical, ignoring the wisdom and reality of the past.
So, just to be clear, when Burke defends tradition and prejudice, he's not defending irrationality.
No, the source stresses this. It's not defend tradition because it's tradition. It's defend tradition because it's presumed to be historically rational, likely embodying more wisdom than any individual's bright idea.
And underlying all of this prescription, presumption, prejudice, historical reason is that fundamental view of society.
It all comes back to that. Burke's whole critique flows from seeing humans as social creatures shaped by society. It aligns with the classic organic conception of society.
Society as a body.
Exactly. Not a machine, but a living organism. A complex web of mutually interdependent institutions and traditions, with individuals deeply connected like organs. And the big implication. Change one part, you affect the whole system, often in ways you didn't expect.
And Burke thought the liberals just didn't get this organic nature.
He did. Their failure to appreciate prescription, presumption, prejudice stem from seeing society as just a collection of property and power-seeking individuals, a mechanical sum of its various individual parts. Social atomism.
Believing the individual comes first, society second.
Right, prior to and higher than society. And because they saw society atomistically, Burke argued, they couldn't see the damage their philosophy would cause. When they attacked aristocratic privilege or church power, they thought they were just dealing with isolated parts.
They didn't see the interconnectedness.
Exactly. They couldn't see how institutions like the aristocracy or the church were intertwined with all those other institutions and traditions that formed the basis for actual rights, prescription, legitimate authority, presumption, and sensible order, prejudice. So they just couldn't grasp that imposing abstract equality by force must inevitably destroy the whole social order.
It's a profound critique of trying to engineer society from abstract plans.
It really shifts the focus from, is the idea good, to what happens when you try to apply this idea to this complex, living thing called society.
And that basic tension, society as individuals versus society as an interconnected whole, feels incredibly current. You think about debates over community, identity, even how technology shapes us. Burke's organic view, how does it fit or clash with all that? That fundamental question still seems wide open.
Absolutely. It provides a lens for so many modern discussions. Okay, so if leaders shouldn't be abstract philosophers, how should they act? Let's shift from the critique to Burke's idea of practical governance.
Right. The source says the real issue for Burke was how those revolutionary leaders should have behaved. His answer: political leaders cannot approach their task as academic philosophers. Pure philosophy, metaphysics, they just do not belong in practical political decisions.
Instead, leaders need to get their principles from society itself, rely on history, on that collective wisdom or prejudice, and the skill, the art of navigating this complex reality, guided by experience and context, not abstract logic. Burke called that prudence.
And he really valued it highly. He said, pure metaphysical abstraction does not belong. Morality admits exceptions, demands modifications. And these modifications aren't made by logic, but by rules of prudence. Prudence is first in rank of the virtues political and moral, the director, the regulator, the standard of them all.
Prudence reigns supreme. But, okay, relying on prejudice still brings up that issue. Not all traditions or common beliefs are good. Think about racial prejudice, for instance.
Burke wouldn't defend that, surely.
No, and the source is clear on this. His own actions defending American rights, advocating for Irish Catholics, supporting dissenters, prosecuting Hastings based on universal morality show he opposed unreasonable prejudice.
So prudence isn't just blind acceptance of the status quo.
Not at all. The statesman needs discernment. The task is to maintain prejudice where it is rational and to alter it where it is clearly irrational. Burke's standard for a statesman: a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve taken together.
That changes the whole picture. It's not about just standing still.
Exactly. The question for a Burkean leader isn't how do I freeze everything? It's, okay, given what we have, the history, the people, when and how should I try to make things better?
And he had guidelines for improvement. Like, only when there's a real problem.
Yes. First condition: improve only when there's a specific and concrete grievance causing actual harm or injustice.
And even then, be careful.
Right, with the caveat that fixing it must lead to a greater good or a lesser evil than just leaving it alone.
Yeah.
Because change always has ripple effects in that organic society.
And then there's that crucial difference in how you improve: change versus reform.
Burke draws a sharp line. Change, he says, alters the substance of the objects themselves. It throws out everything, good and bad. Change is novelty. It's trying to fix problems by altering the whole structure of society like the French did. He thought that inevitably does more harm than good because existing institutions have that embedded historical reason.
Versus reform.
Reform, Burke says, is not change in the substance, but a direct application of a remedy to the grievance complained of. It means targeting the specific problem without altering the basic structure of society.
So the prudent conservative statesman improves through careful, targeted reforms, not radical, abstract change.
And while Burke resisted absolute rules in politics, he offered some guiding principles for these reforms. First, follow public opinion. Don't force it. To follow, not to force, the public inclination is the true end of legislature.
So laws should reflect changes happening in society, not try to engineer society.
Pretty much. It fits with prudence. The community's general sense holds that collective wisdom, a better guide than one legislator's theory.
Okay, second principle. Reforms should be early and temperate.
His quote is, "It is the interest of government that reformation should be early. It is the interest of the people that it should be temperate." Early, because that stops grievances festering until they explode into revolution.
Makes sense. And why temperate?
Temperate reforms, he argued, are more likely to last. They have a principle of growth. You can adapt them, build on them. They let you see the effects, adjust as needed. Radical change, it doesn't have that. It's often reversed when its flaws become clear.
And the third guideline connects back to that organic view of society. Leaders represent the whole nation, not just their voters.
Exactly. Because society is an interconnected whole. A politician focused only on their district, ignoring the national good. Burke compared it to a doctor treating only one organ, messing up the whole body. So voters should choose people with the wisdom and courage to look at the larger public good.
Which connects to that controversial idea he had: virtual representation.
Yeah. If a representative serves the whole nation and society is organic, Burke reasoned you don't necessarily need perfectly equal voting districts or everyone having a vote. People could be virtually represented, even without casting a ballot themselves. This was part of why he resisted reforming the very unrepresentative British Parliament of his day.
And for liberals, especially Americans, focused on no taxation without representation. That sounds really off.
It does, because the liberal view, focused on individuals protecting interests, says only an equal vote works. But Burke's organic starting point led him to a different conclusion about representation. The term itself, virtual representation, kind of entered the political lexicon through these debates.
Okay, let's loop back to the French Revolution and Burke's predictions. The source calls them correct, even prophetic.
He argued that by wrecking the traditional prescriptive sources of authority, the sole basis of authority, in his view, the revolutionaries were paving the way for rule by sheer force or raw power. And that, he believed, would mean the end to liberal ideals of justice and equality for all.
And he specifically predicted a military dictatorship.
He did, famously predicted a military dictatorship under an all-powerful leader who would become, quote, your master, the master of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic. He basically described Napoleon before Napoleon was fully in charge.
And this wasn't just a random guess. It flowed from his analysis.
Absolutely. Burke reasoned, strip away tradition, prescription, the old ways people accepted authority, what's left. People have no other option but to turn to raw power, to a strong man, because there's no other shared basis for legitimacy. He stressed the role of those intermediary groups, social classes, churches, local bodies, guilds.
They act as checks on central power.
Yes, strong barriers against the excesses of despotism, because each had its own sphere of authority based on tradition and resisted encroachment. Destroy them.
And you get centralized power.
An inevitable breakdown of social distinctions, leading to an equally inevitable centralization of power.
And destroying those groups also affects individuals directly.
Hugely. Those associations also act as a buffer between the central power and individual citizens. Eliminate them, and individuals stand utterly alone. They become just a multitude of faceless entities, a homogeneous mass.
Powerless and isolated.
Yes. And cut off from group identity and purpose, they become isolated, lonely, and demoralized, losing the ability to even imagine alternatives. And for the central power, there's nothing in the way of implementing the most extreme despotism.
And the irony Burke saw was that the revolutionaries wanted this mass society.
Precisely what the revolutionaries aimed at, because their abstract rights doctrine hated social distinctions. Though the source notes, Burke saw, like Marx later, that this doctrine didn't hinder bourgeois property rights. But what they failed to grasp, Burke argued, was that by leveling society, they made tyranny more likely, not less. They thought attacking prescriptive rights ended tyranny. Burke saw it creating the conditions for it.
And this whole analysis, mass society, centralized power, was groundbreaking.
Hugely influential. Burke was the first to note the emergence of mass society from revolution, and the first to see the link between it and the centralization of power. This link really worried 19th century liberals.
Because it exposed a potential problem in their own philosophy.
Exactly. Emphasize the individual too much, cut them loose from social groups, and you might accidentally create the mass society where a centralized state could crush those very individual rights. Liberals wrestled with this paradox that Burke was the first to grasp.
So Burke's big distinction. French Revolution destroys prescriptive authority, leads to tyranny and mass society. Different from 1688 or 1776.
Yes. Even though they shared some liberal language, the French path was fundamentally destructive in Burke's view. Many fellow Whigs didn't see it at first, focusing only on the ideals. Only later, when the tyranny became obvious, did Burke's analysis gain wider acceptance. Before that, some saw him as a traitor to liberty.
That distinction, radical change versus reform, the role of mediating groups, it still feels central today. When is revolution needed? When is reform better? And how do groups or their absence shape power dynamics now with governments, corporations, tech platforms?
It definitely gives us a framework for thinking about those questions.
Okay, let's tackle this apparent contradiction. Burke, a Whig, associated with Locke and limited government, fiercely attacks the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. How does that work?
The source says for Burke, the contradiction did not exist. He saw figures like Locke and events like the 1688 Glorious Revolution differently. Not as radical breaks, but as a reaffirmation of traditional British values and rights.
So he interpreted Locke through a British historical lens, not as universal abstract system.
Pretty much. He saw Locke's ideas, especially on property rights, as fitting neatly with the long-established prescriptive rights of Britain's property classes. Locke showed property as a source of rights. Whigs took that to mean the property had a natural right to rule. And for Burke, crucially, this natural right corresponded precisely to their prescriptive right. It had existed time out of mind.
So he wasn't against Locke in context, but against the extremes to which the French revolutionaries took it, especially under Rousseau's influence.
Right. Burke felt they misread Rousseau's "man is born free, yet everywhere in chains." They took it literally, trying to remove all chains using natural rights, and ended up dismantling society.
Failing to see those chains were, for Burke, the necessary bonds of society.
Exactly. Burke thought they needed careful reform within the existing structure, not radical destruction of the whole basis of social authority.
And that was his deepest criticism, destroying the basis of authority.
Yes. In their rush to remake everything, they were destroying the sole basis of authority, which for him was those prescriptive and traditional structures, which led, inevitably, he predicted, to rule by force or raw power and the end of real liberal ideals. The source again calls him correct, prophetic.
This explains why his thinking ultimately diverged from mainstream liberalism.
It does. The source argues that although Burke was a Whig, his theory wasn't really compatible with where Locke and liberalism went later. If things had unfolded differently, Burke might have realized his objection wasn't just to the extremes of natural rights theory, but to the whole way the revolutionaries reasoned abstract, ahistorical.
And that fundamental difference is why Burke became the father figure for conservatism, the Tory tradition, not the Whigs liberals.
Exactly. But, the source repeats, while his method was anti-liberal, rejecting abstract reason in politics, the content of his desired society was not in content illiberal. He still valued liberty, limited government, just derived and protected differently.
So if not Locke, who does he really sound like philosophically?
The source makes a strong case for Cicero and, most notably, Aristotle.
Back to the classics. That really positions Burkean conservatism differently.
It does. The parallels are there. Like Aristotle, Burke starts his political thinking with the actual feelings and opinions of the citizenry, existing practices, not abstract blueprints. Both see humans as innately social and society as an organic structure of traditions and institutions.
And they both thought teleologically, seeing purpose in development.
Yes. Burke saw the state not just as a contract, but as a moral essence, holding values and institutions evolved over generations, representing historically given rational ethical ideals. It's developing towards something. Now, this idea of natural law evolving in history is tricky, the source notes, compared to traditional fixed natural law, but it links him to Aristotle.
His praise for prejudice as collective wisdom also echoes Aristotle and Cicero on the experience of the ages.
And Burke's ideal statesman, prudent, working with existing materials, sensing the community, is precisely Aristotle's and Cicero's ideal political actor. Even Burke saying, art is man's nature, we shape our world, is seen as Aristotelian, fitting his view of statesmanship.
Thinking of Burke alongside Aristotle really shifts the perspective. It suggests conservatism isn't just about hitting the brakes, but maybe a whole philosophy about human nature, organic society, and historical reason.
It definitely adds philosophical depth beyond just liking the old ways.
Okay, let's widen the lens now. Burke's critique wasn't just of liberalism. The source argues it's a critique of ideology itself.
Yeah, this might be his biggest legacy. His attack on revolutionary liberalism was really an attack on a novel, extremely dangerous form of political thought and action that we now recognize as characteristically ideological.
The word ideology itself came out of that revolutionary period, didn't it? French thinkers trying to create a science of ideas.
Exactly. The ideologues wanted to apply scientific method to society, but through the conservative reaction Burke started, the word ideology took on a different, often critical meaning, the one Burke pioneered. It's a slippery word. It's changed a lot since then.
And Burke pinpointed two key features of these modern ideologies, things that made them different from older political theories.
First is the worldview aspect. An all-encompassing intellectual system based on principles believed to be universally valid.
Like the rights of man being universally true and used to build a total system explaining everything about society.
Precisely. Revolutionary liberalism fit that. Later examples mentioned are Marxism, fascism, nationalism, all starting with some supposedly universal principle, class, race, nation, and building an all-embracing system trying to explain the totality of social and political phenomena. Burke saw this inevitably led to being utopian and fanatical.
Utopian how?
By ignoring real human complexity when applying universal abstractions, like the unrealistic notion that all would be well once governments were compelled to respect natural rights. And fanatical because of the absolute certainty in the utter rightness of the doctrine, meaning opponents weren't just wrong, they were evil.
Okay, worldview is one characteristic. What's the second?
This is crucial. These worldviews become the theoretical basis for mass revolutionary movements.
So it's not just having abstract ideas, it's when they fuel mass action.
Right. Abstract ideas or grand theories aren't automatically bad when intellectuals discuss them. Think classical philosophy, early Marxism. The danger emerges, Burke saw, when they all became the theoretical basis of mass revolutionary movements. They become radical impetuses to mass action.
And when that happens, the ideas get simplified.
Inevitably reduced to utopian political slogans. The nuance gets lost to make them appeal to crowds. This encourages fanaticism rather than sober thought.
Because you have to simplify radical abstract ideas to make them popular?
Yeah, you have to connect with people's unsophisticated and often emotional view of the world. For Burke, the real essence and danger of ideological thinking is precisely this blend, combining a philosophical abstraction with revolutionary passion. That's what turns potentially useful ideas into dangerous, utopian, fanatical ideologies.
And he saw the underlying reason for this happening in his time.
He grasped the sociological shift. Modern governments were becoming more democratic in spirit. Public opinion mattered more. Why? Largely due to the rise of the modern press, which could spread ideas to large masses of people like never before.
Modern communications democratized ideas.
Exactly. Before print, big ideas stayed mostly with elites. Communications allowed intellectuals to reach the masses directly for the first time in history.
And that's the danger for Burke. Democratized ideologies.
Yes, he wasn't freaking out about intellectuals debating. The threat was when these abstract, simplified ideologies got into the hands of the masses. Then, he believed, civilization itself is threatened. The French Revolution showed him ideologies weren't just changing governments, they were used to overturn the very basis of society.
That quote about it being not a revolution in government, but a destruction and decomposition of the whole society.
And that's his huge insight. Modern ideology-driven revolutions are essentially social in nature, not primarily or only political. They weren't just swapping a king for a president. They aimed to totally reorganize social classes, the church, the economic system, and so on. Later ideologies like Marxism aimed for the same total transformation.
We kind of take that social dimension of revolution for granted now.
But Burke saw it first and saw the intimate connection between social revolution and the popularization of ideological worldviews. That connection is why the era since the French Revolution is called the Age of Ideology and the Age of Revolution. Burke saw it coming.
Which explains why he fought it so hard. He felt he was battling a dangerous principle, an example that could spread anywhere and threaten Western civilization.
And the source argues that war has continued. We think of modern wars and revolutions as essentially ideological, fought for democracy, communism, nationalism, aiming for total transformation. Burke saw the dawn of this new era when others didn't.
Okay, but Burke wasn't perfect. The source acknowledges he must be criticized. He missed things.
Definitely. Critique number 1. He really downplayed how bad the Russian regime actually was in France. Tom Paine's famous line, Burke pitied the plumage but forgets the dying bird. He appreciated the surface beauty but missed the deep rot underneath.
Meaning, maybe revolution was inevitable anyway.
Possibly. Maybe reform wasn't enough. He couldn't quite grasp that perhaps a radical break was coming, regardless of ideology.
Critique 2. He didn't fully connect mass communication with the Industrial Revolution.
Right. The source suggests ideologies also reflect industrial society, its new classes, its way of life. Burke missed this larger dimension of social change. Ironically, he supported Adam Smith and early capitalism, but capitalism itself was disrupting the traditions he valued. He maybe blamed ideas too much and underlying economics too little for the revolution.
Third critique. Does his kind of conservatism even fit a big modern nation state?
Good question. His ideas seem geared towards smaller organic immunities like Aristotle's polis. A huge nation-state, or Burke's own British Empire, is very different. Maybe that's why he struggled to get support for reforms in India too vast for real community.
Fourth critique. His philosophy is a bit fuzzy on practical rules.
Because he rejected abstract systems for politics, he gives precious few ground rules beyond use prudence. No detailed theory of the state, no checklist for statesmen. Intentional, yes, but it leaves the conservative leader relying on intuition for that tough call, to reform or not to reform, which might lead to sticking with the status quo too often.
And the last critique, number 5, the historical problem.
This is a fascinating one. Conservatives value history and tradition, but the problem is once you have to explain why tradition is valuable, once you have to argue for it, it's often already too late. The power of tradition, Burke's prejudice, lies in being taken for granted, unthinking. Once you have to defend it intellectually, it shows it's already losing its natural hold. History might have already passed them by.
That sounds like a real catch-22 for conservatism.
It is. But the source finds a silver lining. Even if defending declining values is hard, it serves as a powerful indictment of existing ones. It reminds us what we have lost and what we will lose if we blindly follow current trends. So conservatism acts as a constant and necessary reminder that there exists much potential evil even in our most idealistic political schemes.
So even with flaws, Burke's thought remains a vital, critical voice.
Yes, a crucial counterweight in debates about progress and change.
Now, Burke didn't just critique. He really founded conservatism as a distinct school of thought. But like any school, it went in directions he could hardly have anticipated.
That's right. His ideas influenced things beyond politics, like the Romantic movement in the early 19th century. They shared that emphasis on feeling, community, tradition over cold reason. But Romantics often went well beyond Burke, sometimes idealizing a medieval past against modern evils.
And in political theory, his influence was direct, but sometimes twisted.
Often, contrary to what he would have wished, the source says. His most famous, maybe notorious follower was Joseph de Maistre, a French thinker. De Maistre pushed Burke's ideas towards extreme reactionary conclusions.
Remind us, reactionary versus conservative.
Reactionary wants to literally go back to the past, often an idealized version. Conservative uses the past as a guide for the present. De Maistre was an extremist, hated the revolution, the Enlightenment, wanted absolute monarchy back, aristocracy preserved, the individual totally subordinate to the state.
So Burke's core belief in limited constitutional government, gone in de Maistre.
Utterly alien, yes. Louis de Bonald was another reactionary extremist around then. Reactionary thought never got huge numbers, but it persisted. The source suggests the sheer shock of the French Revolution helps explain how conservatism could morph into this fanatical utopianism of the past.
And looking at all these offshoots, the source makes a crucial and paradoxical point. Burkean conservatism itself began to take on all the characteristics of an ideology.
Crazy, right? Burke wanted to fight ideology, but his ideas got used to build new ones. Romantics created a backward-looking utopia. De Maistre and Bonald, a reactionary, often fanatical worldview. Others twisted the focus on tradition into aggressive nationalism, and extremists even claimed a biological basis, race, blood for nation and tradition, linking cultural superiority to racial superiority, influencing fascism later.
And the source is absolutely clear. These directions were utterly alien to Burke.
Completely. He was neither romantic nor reactionary. Racial superiority, repugnant to him. Even cultural superiority would likely contradict his basic respect for the value and uniqueness of our cultures, the very thing that made him defend Americans and criticize British actions in India.
So the ultimate paradox, conservatism, born to eliminate ideology,
ends up being twisted by some followers into new ideologies. But the source insists that's not his fault. He was the first victim of a very modern phenomenon. Founders of major thought systems have almost invariably been misinterpreted by their followers. Complex ideas get simplified, misused.
That's a really important point about how ideas travel and get distorted. How do we even try to understand philosophies as intended, avoiding the slogans and later baggage?
It takes effort, like this deep dive looking at context, nuances, resisting easy labels, and always being aware of how easily passion can warp complex thought.
Okay, let's try to pull the main threads together from this deep dive.
Okay, so modern conservatism really starts as a reaction to the French Revolution, specifically to the perceived danger of applying abstract liberal ideas directly onto society without respecting history and tradition.
Edmund Burke, the key figure, argued rights are social, prescriptive, rooted in tradition. He valued history, prejudice as collective wisdom, and saw society as organic, not just individuals.
He made that key distinction. Good reform works with society to fix specific problems. Bad change imposes abstract blueprints and destroys things.
And he accurately predicted the tyranny in mass society that would follow the destruction of traditional authority and intermediary groups in France.
Philosophically, he's closer to Aristotle and Cicero than Locke, but his complex ideas were later misinterpreted, sometimes fueling reactionary or nationalistic ideologies, a paradox given his anti-ideological aim.
So Burke's thought really highlights that enduring tension between abstract ideals and concrete reality, the value of experience, and the dangers of revolutionary zeal and simplified, popularized ideology.
And that brings it right back to us, doesn't it? These core debates, Burke raised individual versus organic society, tradition versus abstract reason, the perils of ideology, they haven't gone away. They're absolutely central to our politics today.
Understanding Burke gives you, the listener, a vital perspective on a major political tradition and the roots of ongoing arguments about change, stability, and authority. It makes you ask, where does political wisdom come from? Pure reason alone? Or is historical experience essential?
And a final thought, building on the source's point about Burke's foresight. He saw his era, starting with the French Revolution, as the age of ideology, an age of revolution, linked by the popularization of ideas through things like the press.
Now think about today's mass communication social media. Instant global news, algorithms pushing emotional content tools far beyond Burke's wildest dreams.
Does Burke's warning about abstract ideas fused with revolutionary passion, threatening civilization itself, feel even more relevant, more urgent now? Are we living in an even more intense age of ideology, turbocharged by technology? And if so, how does understanding Burke's original diagnosis help us navigate it?
Definitely something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Burke and the origins of conservatism. We hope it's given you some valuable context and things to think about. Keep exploring, keep questioning.